Morning. Today is Thursday, December 12th. My name is Nicole Parker, and I work with Churches for Middle East Peace alongside Mae. I am the executive administrator, and today I will be reading the summary notes from Reverend Dr. Mae Elise, prepared with the news about what's happened in the Middle East this past week. As you may know, she has lost her voice at the moment, but she is here and will be monitoring the chat and the question and answers and can respond more live time than she does when she's talking. So please interact with her there as well. Please note also that because of the December holidays and Advent, that this will be our last of our weekly briefings for the rest of the year. We're going to put a survey, turn on a survey in the chat about how we're going to continue these weekly briefings into 2025 and getting some of your perspectives on how you would like that to look. So if you have a chance to fill that out when the poll pops up, we would appreciate your feedback there. We'll now transition into our briefing. Today is day 433 since the October 7th attacks by Hamas on the south of Israel last year. We know the occupation and oppression of Palestinians did not begin that day. We know that the fears and insecurities of the Jewish people existed for centuries before, but that day changed history. And since we have seen even further havoc and devastation wreaked throughout the Middle East, unprecedented around the world in Gaza, and extending to Lebanon and the Hezbollah-Israel war, and that now holds a tentative ceasefire. And since last week, things have exploded in Syria with the ousting of the Assad regime. This past week in Gaza continued to be another week of mass atrocities. The death toll as of last Thursday was at least 44,580 Palestinians killed. A week later, that number has risen by more than 200 deaths to at least 44,805 Palestinians killed and 106,257 wounded since the start of the war. God have mercy. Reuters reported late yesterday, Wednesday evening, at least 8 Palestinians were killed and dozens wounded in 2 Israeli airstrikes that targeted groups of Palestinians tasked with securing trucks bringing aid into Gaza. On Thursday, a third airstrike killed 6 at a house in Gaza City. Medics said at least 30 people were wounded and with several in critical condition. They feared the death toll may rise in the first strike in the western area of Rafah City in the south of the enclave. The day before, on Tuesday, reports indicated Israeli strikes in northern and central Gaza killed at least 33 Palestinians, most of them in Bet Lahia, adding that one strike in the northern Gaza City killed at least 22 people, including women and children. At least 7 Palestinians were killed and several others wounded in a strike on a house in the Nuseirat camp in central Gaza. Monday's report stated that Israeli strikes across Gaza killed at least 34 Palestinians overnight, and on Tuesday, most of those killed were from the same family, including women and children. On Sunday, Israeli strikes in Gaza killed at least 34 Palestinians and at least 14 people in central Gaza yesterday. Palestinian health officials said Israeli airstrikes and gunfire also killed or wounded scores of people around North Gaza's Carmel Adwan Hospital early Friday, according to the hospital's director. Between Friday and Saturday in Gaza, it wrote that on that day that things in Gaza had continued to be brutally violent, with more than 50 people killed in the past 24 hours. We think it's important to look back at each and every day over the past week. We are giving witness, a testimony to each and every life lost. Be it the life of a child in Gaza, a hostage held captive for hundreds of days, a woman in Lebanon, a Christian in Syria, each and every life is made in the image of God, Imago Dei, and it is important that we give account. Humanitarian aid to northern Gaza has largely been blocked for the past 66 days. The UN said, adding that this has left between 65,000 and 75,000 Palestinians without access to food, water, electricity, or healthcare. Dozens of wounded patients in hospitals in North Gaza are at risk of dying because of the lack of food and water. Earlier this week, the New York Times reported at least 24 Hamas operatives were employed at schools run by the UN Aid Agency for Palestinians, UNRWA, according to internal Hamas documents Israel shared with a news outlet. The International Federation of Journalists said that 104 journalists and media workers have been killed so far in 2024, with more than half of them dying during the war in Gaza. Last week, Saudi newspaper Ashraq al-Aswat reported that Hamas had begun attempts to locate living hostages being held in captivity in Gaza. Palestinian sources affiliated with factions holding hostages said Hamas leadership contacted them in preparation for a possible deal in light of significant progress in indirect negotiations with Israel. Just this morning, the news broke. Hamas told mediators it would agree to a ceasefire deal that allows Israeli troops to remain in Gaza temporarily and handed over a list of hostages it would release under a pact. Most of the Middle East news this week has not been about Gaza, not at all. That's why we wanted to start by telling you what is happening there. Most of the news has been about Syria. On Sunday, December 8th, President Bashar al-Assad of Syria was ousted by an Islamist rebel offensive, ending the Assad's regime's 54-year rule. Assad's regime has been ousted, and what has happened since? Israel has conducted the worst attacks against Syrian lands in history. On Tuesday, Israel announced that they had conducted 480 strikes across Syria over the past 2 days, hitting most of Syria's strategic weapons stockpiles and attacking Syria's naval fleet. In addition, Israel crossed the disputed borders of the occupied Golan Heights and seized several Syrian military positions. On Monday, while the strikes against Syrian targets were being carried out, Israeli news reported that Prime Minister Netanyahu said that Israel wants to have diplomatic relations with the new regime in Syria. The United States, while taking a largely hands-off approach, has enabled an allied militia in Syria's northeast to move into areas once held by Assad and Iranian-backed groups. However, on Sunday, December 8th, the United States struck dozens of self-styled Islamic State group camps and leaders in central Syria and will not allow ISIS to reconstitute, U.S. Central Command said in a statement. The Intercept reported over the weekend that U.S. troops are still deployed in Syria and that they were under fire as the Assad regime was toppling. The article asserts that American troops present in Syria are there on questionable legal grounds, and that according to new Pentagon data, they continue to get attacked. This was not widely reported in the United States this week. Turkish-backed rebel forces in Syria's northwest have pushed into the territory, once garrisoned by Kurdish fighters aligned with the United States. Russia occupied in other parts of the world, like Ukraine, a decade ago, rushed thousands of troops into the country to save Assad. Instead, this week, evacuated some inland bases as it tries to hold on to its pivotal Tartus naval facility on the Mediterranean. Assad had sought asylum, for he and his family arrived in Moscow on Sunday, December 8th, and have been granted asylum, personally approved by President Vladimir Putin. Other senior figures in the Assad regime have fled to Beirut under the protection of Hezbollah. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, today said that the overthrow of Assad was mainly planned in the command rooms of America and Israel. Israel's ambassador to the UN said Israel does not intend to stay in Syria permanently, but will not allow the Iranians to return to their borders. What does the shift in power in Syria and the oustings of the Assad regime mean? The Washington Post describes the situation this way. They say, the scramble for Syria is underway. Days after President Bashar al-Assad quit the country in the face of triumphant rebel forces, foreign powers are jockeying for control. Israel has exploited the security vacuum to cross the disputed borders of the occupied Golan Heights to seize Syrian military positions. The United States, while taking a largely hands-off approach, has enabled an allied militia in Syria's northeast to move into areas once held by Assad and Iranian-backed groups. Turkish-backed rebels forces in Syria's northwest have pushed into territory once garrisoned by Kurdish fighters aligned with the United States. Russia, which a decade ago rushed thousands of troops into the country to save Assad, has apparently evacuated some inland bases as it tries to hold on to its pivotal Tartus naval facility. In the state of Israel, Israel's High Court of Justice, having heard petitions seeking to require the government to establish a state commission of inquiry until October 7th, gave the government 60 days to update the court about its decisions or discussions regarding establishing the commission. Israel's arrest of almost 30 Jewish citizens who allegedly spied for Iran after being recruited via social media has caused alarm in the country and is Tehran's biggest infiltration in decades. Earlier in the week, released Israeli hostages Ilana Gritzweski spoke at a Knesset panel criticizing the Israeli government for not doing more to secure a hostage deal. She referred to a recent Hamas video of hostage Matan Zangauker. She said, "In the video, he said something very powerful. We die 1,000 times a day. Let me tell you what that means. It's the helplessness, being beaten, abused. They broke my back, burned my leg, shattered my jaw. I can't hear in my left ear. All day, interrogations, abuse, no food, no showers. My soul is broken, crushed into pieces. She said, adding that she made Aliyah to the people who cherish life, not to a nation consumed by politics. The IDF has announced that it will arm women field observers in the coming months, more than a year after the October 7th, 2023 massacre, when many of those stationed near Gaza were murdered and abducted. In the West Bank, last night, Wednesday evening, a 12-year-old Israeli boy was killed in a shooting attack on the outskirts of Jerusalem near Bet Jala, outside of Bethlehem, in the occupied territories, and 3 other people were wounded. According to the IDF, a militant opened fire at a civilian bus that was on its way from a settlement to Beit Elite to Jerusalem at the Al-Qaeda junction and fled the scene. The bus continued driving until it reached the tunnel's checkpoint, which was closed to traffic in both directions following the incident. The victim, who was initially reported to be in critical condition and later died from his wounds, was later identified as Yehoshua Aaron Tuvia Simcha. On Saturday, a 30-year-old Israeli was severely wounded and another was lightly wounded in a suspected car ramming attack in the occupied West Bank city of Hebron. On Saturday, Israeli police said that a security guard shot a man and launched fireworks at Israeli forces, who launched fireworks, at the Kalandia crossing in the West Bank. Over the weekend, an Israeli defense source said that Jewish settlers approached the Palestinian village of Kiryut in the West Bank and threw stones at homes, and the IDF forces intervened and stopped the attack. In a separate incident, settlers set fire to Palestinian-owned agricultural property in the Gush Etzion area of the central West Bank. In Lebanon, overall, as things have escalated in Syria, things have seemed to quiet down between Hezbollah and Israel. One of the reasons is that most of the weapons Hezbollah uses come across the Syrian border, which is now much less possible. Over the weekend, the Israeli Defense Forces reported that 4 soldiers were killed in southern Lebanon in a suspected operational incident. The Israeli military said on Saturday it struck a Hezbollah fighter in southern Lebanon who posed a threat to its soldiers, claiming it was operating within ceasefire agreements. Meanwhile, Lebanon's health ministry said Israel strikes on 2 Lebanese villages killed 6 people on Saturday. International interventions include Ireland, who will intervene in South Africa's case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Irish Deputy PM Michael Martin announced Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs said on X that by legally intervening in South Africa's case, Ireland will be asking the ICJ to broaden its interpretation of what constitutes the commission of genocide. Yesterday, the Mossad director, David Barnea, visited Doha on Wednesday and met with the Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed Al Thani to discuss advancing a deal to return the hostages. On December 5th, Amnesty International published in a report identifying Israel's actions in Gaza as genocide. Quote, "Our damning findings must serve as a wake-up call to the international community. This is genocide. It must stop now. States that continue to transfer arms to Israel at this time must know they are violating their obligation to prevent genocide and are at risk of becoming complicit in genocide. All states with influence over Israel, particularly key arms suppliers like the USA and others, must act now to bring Israel's atrocities against Palestinians in Gaza to an immediate end." What's happening in the United States? Secretary Blinken is in the Middle East this week, meeting with the Jordanian Foreign Minister Safadi and other Middle East leaders, including Turkish diplomats in Ankara, to discuss the situation in Syria, the necessity of a ceasefire in Gaza, and other U.S. priorities. Earlier in the week, Blinken laid out U.S. priorities in Syria, including the importance of protecting civilians, including members of minority groups across Syria. The secretary discussed the need for a political solution to the conflict consistent with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. In Congress, Senator Tom Cotton, Republican from Arkansas, late last week introduced the Retiring the Egregious Confusion over the Genuine Name of Israel's Zone of Influence by Necessitating Government Use of Judea and Samaria, Recognizing Judea and Samaria Act. Legislation would require all U.S. documents and materials to use the historically accurate term Judea and Samaria instead of the West Bank. If passed, this would make it illegal to use the term West Bank. UN Security Council Resolution 2254, unanimously adopted on 18 December 2015, calls for a ceasefire and political settlement in Syria. This document describes the roadmap for Syria's political transition. As of 2024, no real progress has been made to implement the resolution. The negotiation reached a stalemate previously due to the inability to agree on a venue for the talks. Prior to heading to the Middle East, in honor of Human Rights Week, the State Department hosted Secretary of State Antony Blinken put out a statement about global accountability for wrongful, abusive, and unjust detentions, not to mention the terribly unjust practices of administrative detention employed by Israel against Palestinians. We celebrated last week the release of Leah Nasser, the young Palestinian Christian woman held for 8 months under administrative detention, but thousands of Palestinians continue to sit in Israeli prisons under this practice. In addition, you will recall that this past month, Israeli lawmakers have said the practice of administrative detention will no longer be applied to Israeli settlers in the occupied territories, thus making the law one that is only applied to Palestinians and not to Israeli settlers. It is worth noting that apartheid is defined as two different laws being applied to people groups living in the same land. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is expected to travel to Israel, Egypt, and Qatar this week in a final attempt to reach a hostage release and ceasefire deal before President-elect Trump's inauguration. The family of Turkish-American activist Ensar Agi, killed by the Israeli forces in September while participating in a protest against settlement expansion, will meet U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and call for an independent U.S.-led probe into her killing. This past week, one of Mae's dear friends who leads the Catholic Relief Service Gaza head of office, Bassam Nassar, said this about his visit to North Gaza, where he had the opportunity to be with both the Greek Orthodox and Catholic churches. Quote, visiting Gaza's two historic churches after 14 months of displacement stirred mixed emotions within me. On the one hand, I felt a sense of relief and happiness to see the main buildings largely intact, with only minor damage. However, the severe destruction and damage to other facilities within the church compounds painted a starkly different picture. The sight of people who had sought refuge there after losing their homes was heartbreaking. Their faces and eyes reflect profound sadness, hopelessness, and exhaustion. In contrast, Archbishop Alexius and Father Gabriel stood as symbols of unwavering resilience and steadfastness. Their courage, determination, and deep commitment shone brightly, even among the surrounding devastation. As I left St. Porphyrius Church of Gaza, the third oldest church in the world, I lit a candle and offered a prayer for peace. Watching the candle melt, I was comforted by Father Silas' ritual, collecting the remaining wax to craft a new candle, to be lit once again with yet another prayer for peace. May the next prayer finally be answered. This is our prayer today as well, especially during Advent season, a season of peace. Come, Lord Jesus.